There are moments in life when destiny announces itself not with thunder, but with silence, a quiet stirring in the soul that whispers, everything is about to change. For Amara, that moment arrived on a golden afternoon in her village, beneath the ancient baobab tree, where generations had sealed their fates. She stood there with trembling hands, her heart heavy with the weight of a future she hadn't chosen, bound by ceremonial cloth to a man she barely knew. The village had gathered as tradition demanded, their faces a mixture of pity and curiosity. Some whispered about the shame of it all, a beauty like hers, wasted on a poor hunter, with no family name, no wealth, no promise of comfort. But Amara had learned long ago that life rarely asked permission before rewriting your story. Her stepmother's voice still echoed in her mind, sharp and unforgiving. You will marry him, Amara, or you will leave this house with nothing. So here she stood, her dreams folding into themselves like paper birds caught in rain, while Kofi, the hunter, the stranger, the man with secrets swimming in his dark eyes, remained silent beside her, his jaw set, with the tension of someone carrying a burden no one else could see. The elder raised his staff toward the fading sun, his voice carrying the weight of ancestors and tradition, as he pronounced them husband and wife. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would eventually touch distant shores neither of them could yet imagine. Amara couldn't bring herself to meet Kofi's gaze, not because he was unkind or unpleasant to look at. In truth, there was something quietly magnetic about him, a stillness that spoke of hidden depths. But this wasn't the marriage she'd dreamed of as a little girl, spinning under starlight with her mother, imagining a love that would sweep through her life like wind through grass. This was survival dressed in ceremonial clothing. This was her stepmother's final act of cruelty, disguised as duty. Yet when Kofi turned to her in that moment, his voice low enough that only she could hear, he spoke words that planted the first seed of curiosity in her heart. I know you didn't choose this, but I promise you, one day you'll understand why it had to be this way. The promise hung between them like smoke, substantial enough to see but impossible to grasp. Understanding Amara's story requires stepping back through the years to when joy still lived in her father's house, before death arrived like an uninvited guest and changed everything. She had been a child of laughter and light, running barefoot through red dust, with other village children trailing behind her like planets orbiting a sun. Her mother, Adana, had been the gentle heart of their home, a woman whose hands could coax life from reluctant soil and whose voice could soothe any hurt with the old songs passed down through generations of mothers and daughters. Adana used to hold Amara close on cool evenings and whisper, You have a light inside you, my daughter. The world will try to dim it with jealousy and fear, but you must protect that flame. Promise me you'll never let them extinguish what makes you beautiful from the inside out. Those words became Amara's anchor, especially after the illness came, swift and merciless, stealing her mother before the healers from the neighboring town could even arrive. The grief that followed was a living thing, vast and hungry, devouring the happiness that had once filled their home and leaving only echoes behind. Her father, a good man but weak in spirit, remarried within a year, claiming that every young girl needed a mother's guidance. But Chinwe, the woman he brought home, was as different from Adana as drought is from rain. She arrived with beauty that turned heads, tall and elegant, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that assessed everything as either useful or disposable. She also brought 2 daughters from her previous marriage, girls who had learned their mother's art of calculating worth in material terms. From the very first day, the hierarchy in the household was established, without words needing to be spoken. Amara would eat after Chinwee's daughters had their fill. She would sleep in the smallest room at the back of the house. She would work twice as hard and receive half the acknowledgement. Her father, consumed by guilt he couldn't name and exhaustion he wouldn't admit, traveled more frequently for his trading work, leaving Amara alone with a woman who saw her not as a stepdaughter, but as competition. Every compliment Amara received from neighbors, every kind word from village elders, every glance from potential suitors, all of it deepened Chinwee's resentment, like water carving canyons into stone. The years passed slowly, each one teaching Amara new lessons about survival and silence. She learned to make herself small, to swallow her voice, to find joy in the spaces between cruelty. Morning walks to the river, conversations with elderly neighbors who remembered her mother, moments alone under the vast African sky where she could still feel connected to something larger than her circumstances. But as she grew into young womanhood, her natural beauty became impossible to ignore or diminish. Suitors began appearing at their door with increasing frequency, some wealthy, some kind, some offering futures that sparkled with possibility. Yet Chinwee turned them all away with the same practiced excuses. Amara was too young, too inexperienced, too naive to marry. The truth, which Amara discovered by accident one afternoon, when she overheard her stepmother speaking with the village matchmaker, was far more bitter. "I don't care if he's rich or poor," Chinwee had hissed with venom. "Just find someone who will take her far away from here. I'm tired of watching men's eyes follow her instead of my daughters. I'm tired of her beauty making my girls look ordinary." The words struck Amara like physical blows, each syllable confirming what she'd suspected, but hoped wasn't true. When Kofi first appeared in the village, he arrived with the dry season winds, quiet and unassuming, carrying only a worn leather bag and a hunting bow that had seen better years. He rented a small house on the village outskirts, near where the forest met the river, and began the simple life of a hunter and fisherman. He was respectful to elders, kind to children, and generous with his catch, always ensuring neighbors received shares before he took his own portion. People liked him immediately. There was something solid and trustworthy about his presence, even though no one knew where he'd come from or why he'd chosen their village. He never spoke of family or past, deflecting personal questions with gentle humor and changing subjects with such skill that people often didn't realize they'd learned nothing about him until long after conversations ended. But Chinwee saw opportunity where others saw mystery. Here was a man with no wealth, no connections, no family demanding dowry or respect, perfect for removing the problem that was Amara. She arranged everything in secret, negotiating with Kofi directly, using words like burden and charity, and doing a good deed, painting Amara as someone who needed rescuing from her own inadequacy rather than revealing the truth of her own calculated cruelty. Amara learned of her impending marriage only 3 days before the ceremony. The news delivered with the casual cruelty of someone announcing weather predictions. She had been preparing dinner when Chinwee entered the kitchen, her expression smug with satisfaction, and declared, "You'll be married on Saturday to Kofi the Hunter. I've already made the arrangements. You should be grateful." Not many men would take a girl with no dowry and no prospects. The words landed like stones in dark water, sinking through layers of shock before settling into cold reality. Amara had tried to protest, tried to reach her father, but he was traveling again, conveniently absent during this pivotal moment. And besides, Chinwee made the consequences crystal clear. You'll marry him, or you'll leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. Your father agrees this is for the best. Trapped between impossible choices, Amara spent those 3 days in a fog of grief and resignation, packing her few belongings, her mother's worn prayer beads, a faded photograph, some simple clothes, and steeling herself for a future that felt like surrender. Yet even in that darkness, she made herself a promise carved from stubborn hope. She would survive this. She would find her own definition of happiness, even if she had to build it from dust and determination. The first week of married life unfolded in strange, tentative rhythms that surprised Amara more with each passing day. Kofi's home, though modest by any wealthy standard, possessed unexpected comfort: walls that didn't leak during rains, a solid roof that kept out the harsh sun, windows that caught morning breezes perfectly. More surprising than the physical space was Kofi himself. He made no demands, issued no commands, never raised his voice, or showed the entitlement so many husbands wielded like weapons. Instead, he simply existed alongside her, leaving before dawn to hunt or fish, returning at dusk with enough to feed them both and share with neighbors who needed extra. He moved through the world with quiet confidence, greeting elders with genuine respect, playing with village children who ran to him with unbridled joy, handling conflicts with wisdom that seemed beyond his years. Amara found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the pieces that didn't quite fit together. His calloused hands that somehow held tools with unusual precision. His simple clothes that somehow always looked well-maintained. His humble house that somehow contained books she'd never seen in village homes. At night, after they'd shared meals in comfortable silence, he would sit outside under the stars, staring at distant horizons with the expression of someone waiting for a specific constellation to align. She caught him writing one evening, candlelight illuminating a leather journal, as his hand moved across pages with the fluid grace of someone well-educated and practiced. When she'd asked about it, curiosity finally overcoming caution, he'd simply smiled and said it was poetry. Thoughts, nothing important. But Amara had glimpsed enough of the writing to know it wasn't the rough scrawl of a simple hunter. It was elegant, refined, the penmanship of someone who'd spent years studying. Another night, a visitor arrived on horseback, a man whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked him as someone from the city, someone important. They'd spoken in low tones outside, while Amara pretended to be asleep, catching only fragments. "The board is getting restless. Your brother is making moves. How much longer?" When she'd asked Kofi about it the next morning, he dismissed it as an old friend checking on him. Nothing to worry about. But his eyes told different stories than his words, holding secrets the way wells hold water, deep, dark, and essential. The mysteries accumulated like morning dew, each small oddity adding weight to her growing suspicion that Kofi was far more than he appeared, and their marriage was part of some larger design she couldn't yet perceive. Everything shifted on an ordinary Tuesday that would become, in retrospect, the hinge on which her entire life would swing. Kofi came home earlier than usual, his expression a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that Amara had never seen before. "Pack a bag," he said simply, his voice carrying an urgency that made her heart quicken. "We're going to the city for a few days." The announcement stunned her. She'd never been to the city, had only heard stories from traders and travelers about buildings that touched clouds and streets that glowed with lights even after sunset. The prospect thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. But when she started to protest about costs and practicality, Kofi gently interrupted. "Don't worry about money or logistics. Just trust me." There was that phrase again, the one he used whenever reality seemed to contradict his simple hunter identity. Trust me. But how could she trust someone who kept so much hidden? Still, something in his eyes that afternoon, a vulnerability, a hope, perhaps even a fear of her refusal, made her agree. They left the next morning on a bus that wound through landscapes she'd only imagined, past green hills that rolled like frozen waves and plains that stretched toward infinity, until finally the city rose before them, like a vision from another world entirely. The city salted her senses with its magnificent chaos, buildings of glass and steel that reflected clouds and sun in dizzying patterns, cars that looked like they belonged in magazines she'd seen at the trading post, people dressed in clothes that probably cost more than her father earned in months. Amara pressed her face to the bus window like a child, her breath fogging the glass, as wonder temporarily overwhelmed her anxiety. Kofi sat beside her, and for the first time she noticed how his posture changed as they approached the city. He sat straighter, moved with more authority, wore his simple clothes with the confidence of someone merely costuming rather than displaying their actual status. When they disembarked, the city swallowed them into its currents, and Kofi took her hand. The first time he'd done so deliberately, intimately. His palm was warm and steady against hers, and she felt an unexpected flutter in her chest, a response to his touch that surprised her with its intensity. He led her through crowded streets, where languages mixed and music poured from doorways, past luxury shops with window displays that looked like art galleries, until they reached a building so tall she had to crane her neck backward to see where it ended against the blue sky. The lobby of that building was unlike anything Amara had ever experienced. Marble floors polished to mirrors, chandeliers that cascaded light like frozen waterfalls, walls adorned with gold accents that whispered of wealth beyond imagination. She felt immediately out of place in her simple dress, her worn sandals clicking against marble that probably cost more per square foot than entire houses in her village. But Kofi moved through this space as if born to it, his demeanor shifting subtly from humble hunter to someone who commanded respect without demanding it. Floor-to-ceiling windows that transformed the entire city into a living painting, furniture that looked like modern art, a terrace where the wind carried the sounds of urban symphony from far below. Amara stood in the center of it all, feeling simultaneously elevated and unmoored, like she'd been placed on a pedestal she never asked to occupy. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked, her voice small in the vast space. Kofi moved closer, his hands tucked in his pockets, as if afraid he might reach for her and she might pull away. "Because I needed to know. You'd love me for who I am, not what I have," he said with raw honesty. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who only see my last name, my bank accounts, my potential utility to their own ambitions. I wanted just once in my life to be seen for myself, to be chosen for my character rather than my capital." His vulnerability in that moment was absolute, stripping away the billionaire persona to reveal the lonely man underneath, the one who'd voluntarily exiled himself to a village seeking something money couldn't manufacture. "And your family?" Amara asked, pieces of the puzzle beginning to assemble into a larger, more complex picture. "Do they know about me?" Kofi's expression darkened like clouds gathering before storms. "My father passed away 2 years ago. It's part of what sent me searching for meaning beyond the boardroom. My mother lives in Europe now, still grieving, still unable to be in the country where everything reminds her of him. And my younger brother." He poised, choosing words carefully. "Let's just say, Chidi isn't thrilled about my extended absence, or my choice to marry without consulting the family, or considering how it might affect the company's image." The bitterness in his voice spoke of deeper fractures, sibling rivalries, amplified by billion-dollar stakes and inherited expectations. But I don't care what they think, he continued with growing conviction. You're my choice, Amara. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Proving that what we have is real, regardless of how it started. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love could grow from deception's soil. But doubt was a persistent weed. What happens now? She whispered, feeling like she stood at a crossroads where every direction led into unknown territory. Kofi's answer was simple. Now, we face the world together, starting with a board meeting where I'd like you beside me. The boardroom was designed to intimidate. A long obsidian table reflecting overhead lights, leather chairs that probably cost more than wedding ceremonies, walls lined with windows that made the city feel simultaneously close and distant. Executives and board members filled most seats, their conversations dying to whispers when Kofi entered with Amara at his side. She felt every gaze like physical touch, assessing, judging, measuring her against some invisible standard she couldn't possibly meet. Kofi guided her to a seat near the head of the table, before taking his position at the room's focal point. And watching him transform into CEO was like watching a river change course. The gentle hunter dissolved, replaced by a man who commanded attention through sheer presence. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice carrying authority that needed no amplification. Thank you for your patience during my absence. I know there have been concerns about my leadership, questions about my priorities, doubts about my commitment to this company my father built. A man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, and the face of someone who'd never accepted second place, leaned forward aggressively. Concerns is putting it mildly, Kofi. You disappeared for 2 years, while the rest of us kept this ship afloat. Some of us have legitimately questioned whether you're still fit to lead. Agreement rippled through the room, like wind through grass. But Kofi remained unmoved, his composure absolute. I understand your concerns, and I take full responsibility for the uncertainty my absence created. He acknowledged without defensiveness, but I didn't disappear without purpose. I left to find something this company was built on, but had forgotten in its pursuit of quarterly profits, integrity, authenticity, connection to the communities we claim to serve, understanding of what truly matters beyond balance sheets and stock prices. He let that sink in before continuing. I went searching for truth in a world increasingly defined by pretense and performance, and I found it in the most unexpected place, in a village where people didn't care about my last name or my net worth, where relationships were built on character rather than capital, where I could finally answer the question of who I am when stripped of everything this world told me defined my worth. A woman with sleek black hair and the expression of someone who'd weaponized skepticism spoke up. With all due respect, sir, this company doesn't run on philosophical revelations or sentimental journeys. We need strategy, growth, measurable results, and leadership that's actually present. Her words carried the sharp edge of someone positioning for power, testing whether Kofi's time away had softened him too much for corporate warfare. And you'll have all of that, Kofi replied evenly, refusing to take the bait of her challenge. But not at the expense of our values, not at the cost of losing sight of why we exist beyond enriching shareholders, not by sacrificing what truly matters on the altar of what's merely profitable. He turned to address the full room, his gaze sweeping across faces that ranged from supportive to skeptical to openly hostile. I'd like to introduce you to someone who embodies everything I'm talking about. This is Amara, my wife. The announcement landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of shock throughout the room. Amara felt herself shrinking under the sudden spotlight, every insecurity magnified, by the silence that followed. The salt and pepper man recovered first, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. "Your wife, Kofi, we had no idea you were even in a relationship, let alone married. This is highly irregular, to say the least." His tone suggested more than irregularity. It suggested impropriety, poor judgment, the kind of impulsive decision that raised red flags about someone's fitness to lead a multinational corporation. The black-haired woman leaned back, arms crossed in a posture that screamed disapproval. "And what about the concerns your brother has been raising? Chidi has been quite vocal about his belief that you've become unfit to lead, that your priorities have shifted away from the company's best interests." Before Kofi could respond to the barely veiled threat of his brother's machinations, the boardroom doors burst open, with the timing of someone who'd been listening for the perfect moment to make an entrance. Chidi Okafor strode in with the confidence of someone who believed the room was his by right, rather than invitation, tall like his brother, but carrying himself with an arrogance that Kofi had somehow avoided despite every advantage. "Well, well," Chidi drawled, his voice dripping with theatrical sarcasm. "The prodigal CEO returns, and he's brought a guest." His eyes landed on Amara with undisguised disdain, conducting a head-to-toe assessment that made her feel like merchandise being evaluated for defects. Kofi stood, positioning himself slightly between Amara and his brother, in a gesture of protection that didn't escape anyone's notice. "Chidi, you weren't invited to this meeting." The statement was simple, but the underlying tension transformed it into something more. A boundary being drawn, a challenge being issued, brothers who'd once been close now circling each other like opponents in an arena. Chidi laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "No, but I think the board deserves to know the full story before they make any decisions about leadership, don't you?" He circled the table slowly, deliberately, each step calculated for maximum dramatic effect. "Did my dear brother tell you where he found his so-called wife?" Chidi asked the room, though his gaze remained fixed on Amara, like a predator who'd identified the weakest point in his opponent's defense. "Or why he married her?" The questions hung in the air, poisonous and designed to plant doubt. Amara's stomach dropped, anticipating whatever revelation would come next, whatever ammunition Chidi had gathered to weaponize against them. Kofi's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Careful, Chidi." But Chidi was too committed to his performance to stop now. Too invested in undermining his brother to consider the consequences of cruelty. "He married a village girl," he announced to the room, as if revealing a scandal. "No education beyond basic schooling, no family connections, no social standing, no dowry, nothing that would make this anything other than some misguided experiment in playing the humble hero, slumming with the common people before returning to his throne." The words were designed to wound, to diminish, to reduce Amara to a footnote in Kofi's story rather than a person with her own value. And for a moment, they succeeded. Amara felt herself shrinking, felt all her insecurities rising up like a tide threatening to drown her. But then something shifted inside her, some deep reservoir of strength that her mother had planted years ago, finally breaking through the surface. Amara stood, her movement quiet, but commanding enough that even Chidi paused mid-circle. When she spoke, her voice was low, but it carried to every corner of that boardroom with perfect clarity. "You're absolutely right," she said, meeting Chidi's gaze without flinching. "I am from a village. I don't have a degree from an elite university or connections to powerful families. I don't know the first thing about corporate strategy, or stock portfolios, or whatever else you all discuss in rooms like this." She paused, letting her words settle. but I know about integrity. I know about loyalty that isn't purchased or performed. I know about love that exists without calculation, without agenda, without measuring someone's worth by their bank balance or their last name. Her gaze swept the room, including everyone in her statement. And if that's not valuable in your world, if character and authenticity and genuine human connection don't matter in your boardrooms and your business dealings, then maybe, just maybe, your world needs to fundamentally change. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that makes ears ring and hearts pound. Even Chidi seemed momentarily stunned, his prepared attacks dissolving in the face of Amara's quiet dignity. An older board member, a woman with gray hair styled elegantly and kind eyes that suggested she'd seen enough of life to recognize truth when it appeared, broke the silence with a small smile. "I think that's the most sensible thing I've heard in this room in years," she said softly, her words carrying weight that came from decades of respect, earned rather than demanded. A few others nodded, their expressions thoughtful rather than dismissive, and Amara saw something shift in the room's energy, not universal acceptance, but at least openness to reconsidering their initial judgments. Chidi's face darkened, his performance interrupted, and his ammunition proving less effective than anticipated. "This is absurd," he snapped, desperation creeping into his voice. "You can't seriously be considering—" But Kofi had heard enough. "This meeting is over," he declared with finality that left no room for debate. "I'll send out a formal memo tomorrow, outlining the company's new direction and my vision for leadership going forward. Those who wish to remain and contribute to that vision are welcome. Those who don't, the door is always open, including for family members who'd rather undermine than support." He took Amara's hand, the gesture both protective and declarative, announcing to everyone present that she wasn't a liability to be managed, but a partner he'd chosen deliberately and would defend fiercely. As they moved toward the exit, Chidi's voice followed them, sharp with the bitterness of someone watching power slip through his fingers. "You think this changes anything? You think marrying some nobody makes you noble or wise? You're still the same man who ran away when father died, who abandoned us when we needed you most." The accusation was designed to wound, to plant doubt, not just in the board's mind, but in Kofi's own heart. For a moment, Amara felt Kofi tense beside her, felt the impact of words that clearly carried history and pain she didn't fully understand. But instead of turning back, instead of engaging with his brother's provocation, Kofi simply kept walking, his hand steady in hers. Because some battles aren't won through confrontation or clever responses. They're won by simply refusing to fight, on terms designed to diminish you, by choosing a different path entirely and having the courage to walk it, regardless of who's shouting from behind. The elevator doors closed on Chidi's face, cutting off whatever else he'd prepared to say. And in the descending silence, Amara felt the weight of what had just happened settling over them both, like dust after an explosion. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythms, indifferent to the personal dramas unfolding in its towers, and a sleek black car waited to carry them away from corporate warfare and into the uncertain territory of figuring out what their marriage would actually mean. The car's interior offered temporary sanctuary, leather seats, and tinted windows, creating a bubble of privacy in the city's chaos. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, both processing the confrontation and its implications. Finally, Amara turned to Kofi, her voice small in the enclosed space. "Your brother really hates me." Kofi's response was immediate and firm. "My brother hates anyone who threatens his ambition or reminds him that there are things more valuable than power and position." This isn't about you specifically. It's about control, about his belief that he should have inherited leadership of the company, about resentment that's been building since we were children, competing for our father's approval. He reached up, gently cupping her cheek, in a gesture so tender, it made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. But he's wrong about one thing. I didn't run away when my father died. I ran toward something, toward finding out who I was, beyond the role everyone expected me to play, toward discovering whether I was capable of being loved for myself, rather than what I represented. His thumb traced her cheekbone softly. Amara, I didn't marry you to prove a point or win some philosophical argument about authenticity. I married you because when I'm with you, I remember who I am, beneath all the noise and expectations and weight of legacy. I'm scared, Kofi, Amara admitted, the confession feeling both vulnerable and necessary. The admission hung between them, honest, raw, and brave in its own way. Kofi's expression softened with understanding that came from his own familiarity with fear. So am I, he confessed, and somehow that admission made him seem more real, more trustworthy than any declaration of confidence could have. I'm terrified that I've dragged you into a world that will judge you unfairly, that will make you feel inadequate when you're anything but, that will chip away at your beautiful spirit until you become as cynical and calculating as everyone else in those boardrooms. The car glided through streets where wealth and poverty existed side by side, the contrast starker than anything in rural villages. But I also believe, I have to believe, that we can navigate this together, that your strength and my resources can create something meaningful, that maybe we can prove love doesn't have to be transactional, and marriages don't have to be strategic alliances. The city blurred past their windows, and Amara found herself thinking about her mother's words from years ago, about protecting the light inside herself. Maybe that's what Kofi was offering, not just wealth or status, but partnership with someone who valued that light, rather than trying to extinguish it for his own benefit. The following weeks unfolded in a whirlwind that left Amara feeling like she'd been caught in a storm that alternated between exhilarating and terrifying. Kofi officially resumed his position as CEO, and the media exploded with speculation and analysis. Who was this mysterious wife who'd appeared from nowhere? Where had she come from? Why had Kofi kept her hidden? Paparazzi materialized outside their hotel, like persistent ghosts, cameras clicking whenever they appeared, telephoto lenses searching for scandal or weakness. Reporters called constantly, fishing for exclusive interviews or personal details. Social media became a battlefield where strangers who'd never met Amara felt entitled to dissect everything from her appearance to her background to her worthiness of being married to a billionaire. The cruelty of anonymous judgment was something she hadn't anticipated. People questioning whether she was a gold digger, whether she'd trapped him somehow, whether she was pretty enough, or educated enough, or sophisticated enough to stand beside a man like Kofi Okafor. The comments ranged from merely skeptical to outright vicious, each one a small cut that accumulated until she felt like she was bleeding from 1,000 invisible wounds. But through it all, Kofi remained her anchor, steady, present, unwavering in his support. He held her hand at every public appearance, his grip firm and reassuring. He introduced her with unmistakable pride at every event, his tone leaving no room for doubt about his commitment. And when critics questioned his choices in interviews or social media posts, he shut them down with responses that were calm but absolute, making it clear that attacking his wife was attacking him, and he would tolerate neither. Still, the pressure was immense, And there were nights when Amara lay awake, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, if she should have stayed in the village, where at least the cruelty was familiar and the expectations were comprehensible. Then came the charity gala, an annual event Kofi had founded years ago to support education in rural communities, honoring the memory of his father, who'd believed that wealth carried the responsibility of lifting others. Amara had been terrified of attending, knowing she'd be thrust into a room full of society's elite, all of whom would be evaluating her with the merciless precision of jewelers examining stones for flaws. Kofi had personally selected her gown for the evening, a stunning creation in emerald green that flowed like water and made her feel, for the first time since entering his world, like maybe she belonged in spaces of beauty and elegance. As they entered the ballroom, she'd felt every head turn, heard the whispers that followed like an invisible wake, seen the cameras flash with the hunger of media, searching for the next big story. The room itself was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers that scattered light like diamonds, tables decorated with flowers that probably cost more than months of village living, a stage where dignitaries and philanthropists would speak about making the world better while sipping champagne that cost hundreds per bottle. Kofi leaned close as they walked, his breath warm against her ear. "You are the most beautiful woman in this room, and not because of the dress." The words steadied her, reminded her that his opinion was the one that mattered most, even as hundreds of other opinions swirled around them, like leaves in wind. The evening proceeded with speeches about impact and change, with presentations of donation amounts that made Amara's head spin, numbers so large they became abstract, losing connection to the reality of what they could actually do. Then Kofi took the stage, and the room quieted with the automatic respect accorded to both wealth and genuine accomplishment. He spoke about the foundation's work, about communities transformed by access to education, about the faces behind the statistics, children who'd become doctors, teachers, engineers, because someone had invested in their potential rather than writing them off based on their circumstances. And then, unexpectedly, he did something that made Amara's heart stop. "Many of you have asked about my wife," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive ballroom. "You've wondered where she came from, why I chose her, what qualifies her to stand in spaces like this." The directness of his address cut through the polite pretense that usually governs such events. "The truth is, I didn't choose her because of her last name, or her social connections, or her resume. I chose her because she reminded me why I started this foundation in the first place. Because she represents the communities we claim to serve, people with strength and dignity, and dreams that deserve support, rather than skepticism, investment, rather than dismissal." Kofi's gaze found Amara in the crowd, and his expression was so full of love and respect that she felt tears threatening. Amara grew up with very little material wealth, but carries more grace and wisdom than most people I've encountered in boardrooms and country clubs combined. She understands struggle not as an abstract concept, but as lived experience. She knows what it means to be overlooked, underestimated, dismissed because of circumstances beyond your control. He paused, letting his words sink into the consciousness of people who'd rarely had to face such dismissal themselves. "And if this work, if this mission to create opportunity and equity is going to mean anything beyond tax deductions and photo opportunities, it has to be led by people who understand it from the inside out, who carry the perspective of those we're trying to serve." Then came the announcement that changed everything again. "Which is why I'm honored to announce that Amara will be joining me as co-director of the Okafor Foundation." The gasps were audible, the surprise rippling through the crowd like a wave. Amara stood frozen, shock rendering her temporarily incapable of movement or speech. Co-director. He'd never mentioned this, never asked, never even hinted that he was considering such a dramatic gesture. She looked at him, questions and panic warring in her expression, and he smiled with such genuine belief in her that she felt something shift inside, a possibility she'd never allowed herself to consider, that maybe she had value beyond what her stepmother had always claimed, that maybe her experiences and perspective were assets rather than liabilities. Before she could fully process what was happening, Kofi gestured for her to join him on stage. The walk from her seat to the platform felt eternal, every step taken under the weight of hundreds of eyes, every movement analyzed and judged. But when she reached Kofi's side, and he took her hand, some of that weight lifted. He leaned close and whispered, "You don't have to decide right now. But I believe in you, Amara. And I think you're exactly what this foundation needs." The microphone stood before her, like a challenge or an invitation, and she realized that this was a moment of choice. She could shrink from it, defer to others presumably more qualified, or she could step into the possibility Kofi was offering. Taking a shaky breath, she stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Thank you. I don't have a prepared speech. I didn't even know this was happening until about 30 seconds ago." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking some of the tension. "But I can tell you this. I know what it's like to be told you're not enough, to have your dreams dismissed because of where you come from or what you lack. I know what it feels like to be invisible in rooms full of people, to have your voice ignored because others decided it wasn't worth hearing." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by years of silenced frustration, finding an outlet. "And if I can use this platform, this unexpected, overwhelming, honestly terrifying opportunity, to make sure other people don't have to feel that way, to ensure that talent and potential are recognized regardless of ZIP code or bank balance, then I'll do everything in my power to make it happen." The applause started slowly, a few people clapping tentatively, as if testing whether approval was acceptable. Then it built, spreading through the ballroom like fire catching, until the entire room was on its feet, in a standing ovation that seemed to surprise even the people giving it. Kofi wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, in a gesture that was both protective and celebratory. And Amara felt something crack open inside her. Years of being diminished and dismissed, finally giving way to the possibility that she might actually have something valuable to offer the world. In the weeks that followed, she threw herself into learning everything she could about the Foundation's work, traveling to rural communities, not as a visitor, but as someone who understood their realities because she'd lived them. She met with students whose eyes shone with dreams they weren't sure they'd be allowed to pursue, spoke with parents who worked multiple jobs, hoping their children might have opportunities they'd never had, listened to teachers who taught with passion, despite limited resources, because they believed education was the key to transformation. And everywhere she went, she saw herself reflected back. The girl she'd been, the woman she was becoming, the future she might have had if circumstances had been slightly different. The communities responded to her in ways they never had, to previous Foundation representatives, opening up about real challenges and needs rather than performing gratitude for cameras, because they recognized her as one of their own who'd somehow found a path to influence. One of her first official acts was returning to her own village, this time not as the discarded stepdaughter, but as co-director of a foundation with real resources and genuine commitment to change. The convoy of vehicles that pulled up to her former home created a spectacle that had the entire village gathering to watch, curiosity and confusion evident on faces she'd known her entire life. Chinwe emerged from the house, looking like she'd seen a ghost, her expression cycling through shock and disbelief, and something that might have been regret, before settling into defensive wariness. "Hello, Chinwe," Amara said calmly, her voice carrying none of the anger or bitterness she'd once felt. Time and perspective had transformed those sharp edges into something softer, wiser, more focused on future than past. "I came to discuss the scholarship program we're launching. We're partnering with the village to send 20 young people to university every year, covering full tuition, housing, and living expenses." She paused, watching her stepmother process this information. "And I wanted to personally invite your daughters to apply. They're exactly the kind of students we want to support." Chinwei's face went through another series of emotions. Confusion about why Amara would help the daughters of someone who'd treated her so cruelly. Suspicion that this was some elaborate revenge scheme. And finally something like shame, as she realized that Amara was offering grace where cruelty had been given. "You're serious?" she managed to ask, her voice small, in a way Amara had never heard before. "Completely serious," Amara confirmed. "I don't believe in revenge or perpetuating cycles of hurt. I believe in transformation, in creating opportunities, in ensuring that the next generation doesn't have to struggle the way we did." Chinwei's eyes filled with tears, whether from shame or relief or some complex mixture of both. Amara couldn't tell, and didn't particularly need to know. "I didn't know," her stepmother whispered, the confession sounding like it was being pulled from somewhere deep and painful. "I thought you'd be trapped forever with a poor hunter. Thought I was just getting you out of my house." Amara nodded, understanding that cruelty often comes from fear and insecurity rather than pure malice. "He was never poor, Chinwei. But even if he had been, I would have been honored to stand beside him. Because love and partnership aren't about bank accounts. They're about character, respect, and choosing each other every day, regardless of circumstances." She turned to leave, her business concluded, but paused for one final thought. "We're also offering financial literacy and business development workshops for women in the village. You might find them valuable." The offer hung in the air. Another act of grace, another opportunity for transformation. As Amara walked away, toward the waiting vehicles and the life she'd built from the ashes of what was supposed to be her punishment, she felt lighter than she had in years. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about excusing what had been done to her. It was about refusing to let those experiences define her future. Back in the city, Kofi waited with arms open and pride evident in every line of his face, and together they continued building something neither could have created alone. A partnership rooted in respect, a love that had grown from the strangest beginning into something genuine and unshakable, and a legacy that would touch lives far beyond their own. The elders were right after all. Life flows like a river, in unexpected directions, carrying us toward destinations we never imagined, teaching us that sometimes the greatest treasures arrive disguised as ordinary moments, and that true love reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to see and honor each other's humanity completely. Moral: true love cannot be measured by wealth or status. It reveals itself through authenticity, respect, and the courage to choose what's real over what's easy. Dignity is a treasure no one can take from you, and destiny often arrives disguised as something ordinary, waiting for a heart pure enough to recognize its true value. The greatest transformations happen not when we seek revenge, but when we choose grace, not when we pursue what glitters, but when we invest in what genuinely matters. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Stories that remind us of our strength, our worth, and the power of love that sees beyond the surface. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, may your path be blessed with love, purpose, and the courage to embrace your destiny.